My son called me a useless old man after I lost my job. Days later, I became a millionaire. Harold never possessed material wealth, but his heart overflowed with riches beyond measure. At just 40, when cancer mercilessly tore his beloved wife from his arms, he made a decision that would forever transform two souls, adopting a baby boy abandoned at birth. That child became the blazing sun that pierced through his darkest nights. He raised the boy single-handedly, grinding through bone-crushing double shifts at the mill and delivering newspapers through rain, snow, and scorching heat, all just to keep food on their humble table. When people questioned why he didn't simply enjoy his freedom after such devastating loss, Harold's answer burned with unwavering conviction. Love wasn't meant to be hoarded selfishly, but poured out like water to a thirsty world. To him, raising a child, blood or no blood, was the most sacred calling a man could embrace. He never demanded anything in return. His only burning desire was to witness that boy bloom into a man of honor. The years swept by like rushing wind, and Nathan flourished into a strong, vibrant man. Harold poured every ounce of his being into paying for college, bought him his first car with calloused hands still aching from overtime, and even scraped together the down payment for Nathan's first home. When Nathan's wedding day arrived, Harold's heart swelled as he covered half the celebration costs. The moment his first grandchild drew breath, Harold wept tears of pure joy. He became their silent guardian angel, bringing diapers in the dead of night, filling empty refrigerators when paychecks ran thin, covering utility bills without being asked, and racing to pick up the children whenever Nathan and his wife needed help. He wasn't just a grandfather, he was their fortress, their unbreakable safety net. Even when his own pockets grew thin, he never uttered a single complaint. "Family is worth every sacrifice that burns in my soul," he would declare, and he lived those words with fierce devotion. But then the winds began to shift as Nathan's career soared to new heights. Success brought a beautiful suburban home, financial security, and suddenly Harold felt the crushing weight of being unnecessary. Phone calls turned ice cold and brief. Invitations became rare as shooting stars. Harold would sit alone on the creaking porch of his tiny rented room, his weathered hands clutching the silent phone, his heart breaking a little more each Father's Day that passed without a single ring. Still, he forced himself to smile through the pain. "They're building their own lives," he whispered to the empty air. "Young hearts have so much ahead of them." But deep in his chest, a bitter cold was spreading, the devastating chill of being forgotten by the very souls he had sacrificed everything to nurture. One brutal winter evening, Harold appeared at Nathan's doorstep unannounced, clutching handmade wooden toys that had taken him weeks to carve in his freezing garage. His hands were scarred and bleeding from the careful work, each toy carved with trembling fingers and overflowing love. But when he knocked, the door remained sealed longer than his heart could bear. Nathan's wife finally opened it with a smile that felt sharp as broken glass, while Nathan stood behind her like a wall of stone, arms crossed in cold judgment. "You really shouldn't drop by without calling, Dad," Nathan said. But it wasn't the words that shattered Harold's soul. It was the tone, cutting through him like a blade of ice. As if Harold were nothing more than a bothersome stranger, an unwanted burden. Harold forced his lips into a smile, handed over the toys his heart had poured into, and walked back down those cruel, icy steps, pretending his son's voice hadn't just ripped his heart in two. Later that night, he sat in crushing solitude with a cup of cold tea and memories that burned like fire. He remembered cradling baby Nathan through endless sleepless nights, singing gentle lullabies to calm his frightened cries. He remembered patching holes in his own worn shoes just so Nathan could carry a brand new backpack to school with pride. He remembered sleeping in his frozen car that terrible winter, when he had to choose between rent and Nathan's tuition, and choosing his son's future without hesitation. Those memories now felt like ghosts haunting his empty heart. Nathan had moved on, leaving Harold behind like discarded clothing. The man who once gazed up at him with innocent, adoring eyes and whispered "Dad" like a prayer, now barely acknowledged his existence. The warmth had died, replaced by arctic silence and dismissive glances that cut deeper than any knife. Harold didn't hunger for money or material gifts. All his starving soul craved was to be seen, to matter, to be remembered. But in that suffocating loneliness, a torturous question began eating him alive. Did I give too much? Had his endless river of sacrifice somehow taught his son to forget how to give back? The realization hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest, not from wounded pride, but from love so deep it was destroying him from within. Harold had lived and breathed for his family, had poured his very life force into their happiness. Now, in the bitter winter of his existence, he found himself wondering if his family would ever live for him. The answer, though unspoken, was becoming crystal clear with each passing day, and it was slowly, methodically breaking what remained of his shattered heart. Harold had always been a warrior in working man's clothing. Even at 70-something, his weathered hands still gripped the factory time clock 5 days a week at the same thundering industrial beast where he'd surrendered decades of his life. The brutal labor was slowly devouring his aging frame, endless lifting that screamed through his joints, bending that carved fire into his spine, standing for merciless hours until his legs trembled like autumn leaves. Yet Harold never uttered a single complaint. His chest swelled with fierce pride, knowing he earned every dollar through blood, sweat, and sheer determination. Pride that he stood on his own 2 feet, never begging for scraps, not even from the son whose entire existence he had built with his bare hands. His co-workers constantly begged him to hang up his work boots, but Harold would flash that stubborn smile and declare, "Idle hands make a rusty soul." Willie, what he never revealed was the crushing truth. His rent hung by the thread of that precious paycheck, along with the few small treasures he still managed to buy for grandchildren who barely remembered his name. But one merciless Tuesday morning, fate struck like a lightning bolt. While wrestling heavy crates into a truck's hungry mouth, Harold's feet betrayed him on the rain-slicked metal ramp. His fragile body crashed against the platform's razor edge with a bone-chilling thud that echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. White-hot agony exploded through his legs like molten lava. Co-workers swarmed around him in panic, but Harold lay crumpled like a broken bird, barely able to draw breath. The ambulance wailed through the storm, and at the sterile hospital, doctors delivered the verdict that shattered his world. Herniated disc, nerve damage, a body finally surrendering after decades of punishment. "You'll need complete rest for several months," they pronounced like judges sentencing him to exile, maybe longer, maybe forever. Harold nodded with trembling lips, desperately hiding the raw terror blazing behind his eyes. Rest? He couldn't afford rest. Rest meant financial suicide. He limped from the hospital clutching a cane like a lifeline, and prescription bottles he couldn't afford to fill. Empty promises in plastic containers. Back in his cramped apartment, reality crashed over him like a tidal wave. Bills screamed from every surface. His refrigerator stood nearly empty, mocking him with its hollow echo. For the first time in decades, panic clawed at his throat. He was drowning and no one was throwing him a rope. With hands shaking like earthquake tremors, he dialed Nathan's number, maybe just to hear a familiar voice, maybe to whisper the unthinkable, a plea for help, though his pride fought every syllable. The phone rang into the void. Desperate, he typed with arthritic fingers. Had a fall, out of work for a while, could use a little help if possible. He stared at the screen like a man waiting for salvation. Minutes crawled by like hours. Hours felt like eternities. Then the reply arrived like a dagger to his soul. "Sorry to hear that. Things are tight right now. Hope you get better soon." Harold's blood turned to ice water. Things are tight. Nathan had just posted photos from their luxury cruise to the Bahamas. Crystal blue waters, champagne sunsets, his family's laughter echoing across paradise. Their driveway boasted a gleaming new SUV that cost more than Harold made in 2 years. Tight. Harold knew Tight like an old friend. Tight was rationing a single can of soup across 2 meals. Tight was digging through donation bins for clothes that fit. Tight was choosing between electricity and groceries. He wasn't angry. Anger required energy he no longer possessed. He was devastated, utterly, completely devastated. His own flesh and blood couldn't spare $100 for rent or even a bag of groceries. Not a visit, not a phone call. Just those 4 words that carved deeper than any physical wound. Hope you get better soon. The next day, Harold dragged his broken body to Nathan's doorstep. He didn't want money. His pride had been murdered, but his soul still breathed. He just craved the warmth of his grandchildren's arms, maybe one genuine hug, maybe proof that he still existed in their universe. But when Nathan opened the door, his face held all the warmth of a winter grave. "Dad, this isn't a good time," Nathan said, his voice sharp as broken glass, eyes darting nervously over his shoulder. "We're having people over. Can we talk another day?" Harold's heart shattered as he glimpsed past his son, warm laughter dancing in the air, wine glasses catching firelight, a cozy scene that felt like paradise, a paradise where he would never belong. Not tonight, not ever, it seemed. "I understand," Harold whispered, his voice barely more than a ghost, tipping his worn hat as he turned his back on the only family he'd ever known. That night, as rain wept against his window like tears from heaven, Harold sat in crushing silence. This wasn't sadness anymore. He had traveled far beyond that familiar country. This was something far more terrifying, the bone-deep stillness that settles over a heart after it has been shattered one too many times to ever heal completely. He stared at the mountain of unpaid bills, the purple bruises still painting his back like a road map of pain, and the empty chair where a grandson's laughter should have lived. "Maybe," he whispered to the darkness that seemed to swallow him whole, "maybe this is how stories end for forgotten men like me." But fate, as Harold would soon discover, wasn't finished writing the final chapters of his extraordinary life. 3 days later, Harold dragged his battered body into the cramped corner store that had become his lifeline, a beacon at the end of his crumbling block. His energy reserves were practically empty, but desperation drove him forward. He needed the bare essentials, bread and milk to silence his growling stomach, maybe a dented can of soup if the gods smiled and put one on sale. At the counter, he counted out his precious coins, like a miser guarding his last treasure, each clink echoing his financial desperation. As he turned to shuffle back into his bleak reality, Luis, the young clerk whose genuine smile had become Harold's only source of human warmth, lit up like a Christmas tree. "Hey, Mr. H, Destiny's calling your name today. Every $20 purchase scores a free scratch-off ticket. You want it?" Harold's weathered eyebrow arched skeptically. "Son, I gave up believing in luck the day life started using me as a punching bag," he muttered. Yet something made him accept the small silver card. He slipped it into his coat pocket like a forgotten prayer, never giving it a second glance. Back in his lonely apartment, that scratch ticket lay abandoned on his kitchen counter like a discarded dream. It wasn't until the following morning, when he was mechanically tidying his sparse possessions, that the silver rectangle caught his eye again. "What the hell?" he grumbled, grabbing a dime with fingers that had built and broken so much over the decades. As he slowly scraped away the silvery film, numbers emerged like secrets being whispered by the universe itself. At first, his tired mind couldn't process what blazed before him. 3 matching gold bars gleamed like buried treasure. Beneath them, a message that made his heart stutter. "Winner. Claim at lottery office." A hollow laugh escaped his throat, bitter as black coffee. "Probably $10, maybe 20 if I'm blessed," he muttered to the empty room, "just enough to buy another can of soup and postpone starvation one more day." But when he shuffled back to the store that afternoon, Luis nearly collapsed behind the counter. "Mr. Harold, sweet Jesus, do you have any idea what you're holding?" The boy gasped, his eyes wide as dinner plates. This isn't $10, sir. This isn't even $100. You're holding the grand prize ticket in your hands. Sir, you just won $6 million. Harold stared at the kid like he'd lost his damn mind. You're pulling my leg, son. But Lewis was already dialing frantically. His manager, the lottery office, anyone who could confirm this impossible miracle, his hands trembling like leaves in a hurricane. Harold stood frozen in that cramped store, the scratch-off burning in his palm, reality refusing to penetrate the fortress of disbelief he'd built around his heart. The next 24 hours exploded like a fireworks display, phone calls that wouldn't stop ringing, mountains of paperwork that needed his signature, stone-faced officials scrutinizing his ID like he was a criminal, a hungry reporter from the local rag practically salivating as he begged for a quote. No comment, Harold growled, still drowning in disbelief. The check was devastatingly real. The flashing cameras were blindingly real. The money was earth-shatteringly real. But Harold, he felt like he was floating outside his own body, watching someone else's impossible dream unfold, still tired, still aching, still carrying the fresh wounds of abandonment in his chest. During the cab ride home, he pressed his face against the rain-streaked window, watching the city that had chewed him up and spit him out for 7 decades. For the first time since he could remember, the crushing weight of worry had been lifted from his shoulders. No more sleepless nights about rent, no more choosing between medicine and meals, no more rationing soup like liquid gold. He could finally breathe without drowning. But beneath the relief, something far more intoxicating began to simmer in his veins, a quiet, dangerous sense of power that made his pulse quicken. Not revenge, not yet, but awareness. Crystal clear, bone-deep awareness. He had been discarded like a broken appliance, tossed into life's garbage heap the moment he stopped being useful. And now, the same forgotten old man they had all ignored, pitied, dismissed, treated like human debris, was a millionaire. He told no one, not even Margaret from the senior center, the closest thing to a friend he had left in this cold world. He just let this magnificent secret burn inside him like a hidden flame, melting the ice that had formed around his abandoned heart. "Let's see who really gives a damn about a worthless old man now," he whispered to the darkness, his eyes gleaming with newfound purpose. That weekend, Nathan's name flashed on his phone, not to check on his father's broken body, not to offer comfort or love, but to bark orders about signing some meaningless tax document. "I'll swing by Monday," Nathan said, with all the warmth of a tax collector, like Harold was just another tedious item on his busy schedule. Harold's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but held infinitely more power. "Sure, son. Come by any time." He hung up the phone, and for the first time in months, laughter rumbled deep in his chest. Not bitter, but rich with anticipation. The same ungrateful man who had slammed the door in his face was about to walk unknowingly into the home of a lottery winner. Harold didn't know exactly what words would spill from his lips when that moment arrived. But he knew one thing with absolute burning certainty. This time, he would be the one holding all the cards. He would decide who was welcome and who would taste the bitter medicine of rejection. Monday dawned gray and merciless, the sky weeping tears of ice that matched the storm brewing in Harold's soul, the kind of bone-chilling weather that used to make him curse the heavens. But today, he embraced it like an old friend. It mirrored his mood with surgical precision. He brewed coffee that filled his small apartment with warmth he no longer felt in his heart, swept the front steps with methodical care, and settled by the window like a spider waiting for prey. No music to soften the edges, no television to drown out his thoughts, just suffocating silence and the occasional death rattle of his old wooden floors. When Nathan's SUV finally prowled up the street, Harold's jaw tightened at the familiar predatory growl of that engine. The same gleaming machine Nathan had used to transport him to this prison of an apartment just weeks ago, dumping him like unwanted furniture. That memory still burned like acid in his veins. Nathan didn't even have the decency to knock. He burst through the door like a conquering king claiming his territory. "Hey, Pops," he called with casual cruelty, strutting in with a thick envelope clutched in his manicured hands. "Just need you to sign this real quick. Tax deduction stuff for the house. You know, the mansion I've been slaving to pay off." Harold didn't respond immediately. He simply studied his son like a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. Nathan looked exhausted, but not in the bone-deep way that Harold knew intimately. This was a different breed of tired, the hollow fatigue that comes from a soul slowly rotting from within, from chasing fool's gold and empty status symbols while trampling everything sacred underfoot. Harold's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You didn't ask how I've been healing." Nathan blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I figured you were managing. You always do. Look, can you just sign this? I'm double parked and the meter's running." Harold accepted the envelope, but held it like it contained poison. "I need to understand something, Nathan. Help me piece this puzzle together." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. "How exactly did we arrive at this wasteland? I raised you from a helpless infant. I poured every drop of my life's blood into making you the man you are today. And now, you treat me like I'm some inconvenient errand you need to check off your list." Nathan's sigh carried the weight of 1,000 burdens. "Dad, please don't turn this into some melodramatic soap opera. We're all drowning in our own problems. It's nothing personal." Those two words, "nothing personal," struck Harold like a lightning bolt of pure rage. "I see," Harold said with terrifying calm, placing the envelope on his coffee table like he was setting down a loaded weapon. "So, when you slammed your door in my face and left me bleeding on your doorstep, that wasn't personal either." Nathan's eyes rolled with the practiced indifference of a man who had perfected the art of emotional cruelty. "You weren't contributing to the household anymore, Dad. We have children to feed, bills to pay. You were just consuming oxygen and taking up valuable real estate." The words hit Harold like a sledgehammer to the chest. He nodded slowly, each movement calculated and deliberate. "Taking up space." Of course. He rose from his chair with the grace of a man who had just discovered his true power, walked into the kitchen with measured steps, and returned carrying a steaming cup of coffee. "Would you care for some?" he asked with chilling politeness. Nathan hesitated, clearly disturbed by the sudden shift in his father's demeanor. Yeah, sure." They sat in suffocating silence, the air thick with unspoken tensions. Nathan's eyes wandered around the cramped apartment with undisguised disgust. "This place still reeks like a funeral home," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You really should surrender and move into one of those assisted living warehouses, Dad. Places with professional babysitters and sterile beds. You'd be so much better off rotting there instead of embarrassing yourself here." Harold sipped his coffee with the patience of a predator, savoring the moment before the kill. The arrogance poisoning his son's words was deafening. Nathan wasn't here for family, for love, for connection. He was here for signatures, for control, for his own selfish benefit. But Harold was no longer the broken, begging man who had stood shivering on Nathan's doorstep just days ago. That version of himself had died and been reborn as something far more dangerous. He stood again, slower this time, each movement radiating quiet menace, and walked to a drawer that had been waiting for this exact moment. From its depths, he extracted a thick envelope, eerily similar to the one Nathan had brought like a peace offering. "What's that supposed to be?" Nathan asked, his voice cracking slightly. Harold handed it over with the ceremony of a judge delivering a verdict. Inside lay a photocopy of the lottery ticket and an official confirmation letter from the state, both documents glowing with the power to reshape entire lives. Nathan's hands began trembling like earthquake tremors as he read, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost. "Wait, Jesus Christ, this can't be real," he stammered, his voice barely more than a terrified whisper. Harold nodded with the satisfaction of a man watching his carefully laid trap snap shut. $6 million. After the government takes their pound of flesh, just over 4 million finds its way into my bank account. I haven't whispered a word to another living soul yet. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I wanted to conduct a little social experiment first. See exactly how people treated me when they believed I was nothing more than a worthless, broken-down old man with empty pockets. Nathan's face had turned the color of fresh snow, and Harold could practically hear his son's world crashing down around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. Nathan sat frozen, the lottery confirmation letter trembling in his hands. His face went through a cycle of disbelief, confusion, and then a fake smile that Harold had seen too many times. "Dad, this is incredible," he finally said, voice suddenly softer, sweeter. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? We could have celebrated together." Harold just watched him, like someone observing a stranger put on a mask. "I didn't want to be a burden," Harold said quietly. "Isn't that what you said I was?" Nathan laughed nervously, trying to brush off the past. "Come on, Dad. That was a heat-of-the-moment thing. You know I didn't mean it like that." He moved closer, placing a hand on Harold's shoulder. "You've always been there for us. And now it's time we return the favor. You can move back in with us. Better yet, we can get a new house, one big enough for all of us." Harold didn't respond. He just looked down at the untouched coffee cup sitting in front of Nathan. "Let me guess," Harold said slowly. "If I hadn't shown you that envelope, you'd still be asking me to sign something so you could get a deduction." Nathan didn't answer. Harold continued, "When I lost my job, I wasn't expecting handouts. I just thought maybe I'd earned a little dignity." He stood up, walked to the window and stared out at the gray sky. "You kicked me out of a house I helped pay for. You called me useless. You left me in this tiny apartment without checking in once." Nathan shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, Harold turned sharply. "No, let me finish. I stayed quiet for too long. I gave you everything. Raised you, paid for your education, helped with your down payment, took care of your kids when you and Jenna wanted weekends to yourselves. And when I couldn't give any more, you cut me loose like I didn't matter." His voice cracked slightly, but his gaze stayed firm. "I wasn't asking for praise. I just wanted respect, a place at the table, and you took that away." The silence that followed was thick. Nathan looked like a man caught stealing from someone who had nothing left. "I was stressed," he mumbled. "Work, finances. Jenna was pressuring me. We didn't mean to," Harold interrupted. "But you did. And it wasn't just one moment. It was the way you stopped seeing me as a person the second I stopped being useful." He picked up the lottery envelope and placed it back in the drawer. "This money doesn't change who I am, but it sure showed me who you are." Nathan sat speechless. The warmth he tried to fake had melted under the weight of truth. He suddenly realized that for the first time, his father held the power in the room, not because of the money, but because he finally stopped begging for love. "You're going to be okay, right?" Nathan asked, voice thin. Harold nodded. "Better than okay. I just needed to know the truth, and now I do." Nathan opened his mouth to say something, but Harold raised a hand. "Thanks for stopping by. I'll be in touch, eventually." News travels fast, especially when there's money involved. By the end of the week, Harold's quiet life was disrupted by sudden calls, texts, and visits. People who hadn't spoken to him in years were suddenly just checking in. Even Jenna, his daughter-in-law, who had barely looked at him during family dinners, called to invite him over for Sunday lunch. "The kids miss you," she said sweetly, as if she hadn't insisted he leave their house months earlier. Harold accepted the invitation, not to rekindle ties, but to bring clarity. When Sunday arrived, Harold wore the same old coat Nathan once called embarrassing. He drove himself to their two-story suburban home, the one he'd helped fund years ago. The door opened before he even knocked. "Dad, so glad you're here," Nathan said, overly cheerful. Jenna appeared behind him, smiling tightly. The house was spotless, the table was set, and even the kids were dressed up, pretending to be happy to see Grandpa. Harold could smell the performance from the moment he stepped inside. Dinner began awkwardly. Everyone acted like nothing had happened. "We were thinking," Jenna began, "now that you've got that windfall, maybe we could all go on a family vacation. Somewhere nice, just the six of us." Nathan chimed in quickly. "It'd be a way to reconnect, Dad. Heal old wounds." Harold sipped his water and nodded. "Before we talk about vacations, I'd like to ask something." The room went quiet. "What would you all be saying to me right now if I hadn't won that lottery?" Nathan and Jenna looked at each other. "Dad," Nathan said, "you're taking this the wrong way." "No, I'm asking a serious question," Harold replied. "If I were still jobless, broke, and living alone in that apartment, would you have invited me here today?" His eyes moved to each of them. "Would you have cooked this meal? Told me the kids missed me?" Jenna looked down. Nathan shifted in his seat. Neither answered. "I supported you all for decades," Harold said calmly. "Not just financially, but emotionally. I was there for every scraped knee, every job loss, every hard season. And when I needed help, I got silence." The kids stopped eating. The room now felt too big, too exposed. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I just want the truth to sit in the room for a while. I want you all to feel what it's like to be seen not for your money, but for your worth." He stood up slowly. "I'm not giving anyone anything today. No checks, no promises. Just this. If you want to be part of my life, earn it. Not with fake smiles or flattery, but with respect. Real, earned respect." He looked at his grandkids and softened. "I still love you. But love doesn't mean being blind." With that, Harold walked toward the door. No one stopped him. No one dared. For the first time, Harold's silence wasn't submission. It was strength, and they all knew it. After the cold farewell from his son's house, Harold didn't return home bitter. He returned thoughtful. That evening, he sat in his recliner and looked out the window at the row of modest houses across the street. One in particular stood out, the Garcias, a middle-aged couple, quiet but warm, with 2 kids and a garden always in bloom. They had never asked Harold for anything, not when they saw him struggling with groceries, not when the power went out during a storm. But they always offered a wave, a smile, a helping hand when he needed it most. Harold remembered a moment months earlier when Mrs. Garcia had come to his door with a bowl of warm soup after he slipped on the porch. "Just thought you might need this," she said. No judgment, no expectation, just kindness. Another time, their teenage son helped Harold lift a heavy package into his apartment. No questions asked. They didn't know his financial situation or his former profession. They didn't care. They treated him like a human being, with dignity. It struck him. While his own family had measured his worth in paychecks and gifts, these neighbors had valued him simply for being present. He thought about that as he opened a notepad and began jotting down names. Not of people who had flattered him since the lottery, but of those who had shown up when no one else did. The Garcias were at the top of that list. So were the retired widow 2 floors down, who always invited him for tea, and the quiet janitor at the local library who'd once offered him a ride in the rain. The next morning, Harold showed up at the Garcias' front door with a fresh box of pastries and a soft envelope tucked under his coat. They were surprised, but welcomed him warmly. He joined them at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and laughing with their kids about school and soccer. Before he left, he handed the envelope to Mr. Garcia with a gentle smile. A small thank you for being good people when you didn't have to be. Mr. Garcia hesitated, then opened it, only to find a bank check with more zeros than he could count. His hands trembled. "I don't know what to say," Mr. Garcia whispered, stunned. "You don't have to say anything," Harold replied. "You already said everything through how you live." As Harold walked back home, the sun peeked through the clouds. For the first time in a long while, he felt lighter, not because he gave money away, but because he gave it with purpose. He had spent years sacrificing for people who treated his kindness like obligation. But these small acts of compassion from strangers had restored his faith in humanity. This, he realized, is what wealth was meant for. Not control, not revenge, but quiet, life-changing gratitude. A few days later, as Harold sat on the park bench feeding breadcrumbs to the birds, a familiar voice called his name. He turned and froze. There, standing with a crooked smile and a worn leather jacket, was Walter, his oldest friend from his construction days. They hadn't spoken in over a decade, not out of anger, but simply because life had drifted them apart. Jobs, family, time, it all got in the way. But now, seeing Walter again felt like opening a window in a room long sealed shut. Walter walked over slowly, his limp more pronounced, and took a seat beside him. "Heard about what happened," he said, nodding. "You always did have luck on your side. Just took a while to show up." Harold laughed, really laughed, for the first time since winning the lottery. The two men talked for hours about old job sites, about their wives, about their children, some still close, some gone with the wind. There was a rhythm to it, like picking up a song they both knew by heart. As the sun dipped lower, Walter finally said, "You know what's crazy? You never changed, H. You're still the guy who brought me coffee on cold mornings, who worked double shifts so I could take my kid to the doctor, and now you're the guy who's rich and still sitting on this park bench feeding pigeons." Harold looked at him, eyes wet. "Maybe that's because being poor taught me what being rich really means," he whispered. Walter nodded solemnly. They made a plan to meet again the next week. Same bench, same time. Harold insisted. This time he wouldn't let another decade slip away. But before they parted, Harold handed Walter a small folded note and quietly said, "Don't open it here. Read it when you get home." Inside was a letter and a check, enough to clear Walter's medical debt, fix his old truck, and maybe even take that trip he and his wife always dreamed of. On the back of the note, Harold had scribbled, "For all the mornings you had my back." That night, Walter called in tears. "You didn't have to do that," he kept saying. "I know," Harold replied, his voice steady, "but it's the things we don't have to do that matter the most." And deep down, Harold felt something shift. All his life, he had poured into others who left him empty. But now, in giving to those who never expected anything, he felt more full than ever. Richness wasn't in the dollar signs. It was in the memories rekindled, in the weight lifted off another man's shoulders, in the quiet warmth of knowing you made someone feel seen again. The following week, Harold decided it was time to make peace. Not for their sake, but for his. He bought a bouquet of fresh flowers and some pastries from Margaret's favorite bakery, then headed to his son's house unannounced. As he walked up the driveway, he felt a strange mix of nerves and hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would look past what had happened. Maybe they'd apologize. Maybe his granddaughter would run into his arms again, calling him Grandpa, like she used to. He knocked. The door opened halfway, revealing Linda, his daughter-in-law. Her expression was cold, guarded. "What are you doing here?" she asked, eyes narrowing at the flowers. "I just came to talk," Harold replied, his voice soft. "To see my family." Linda didn't move. She glanced behind her, then muttered, "It's not a good time." Before he could say another word, Harold heard his son's voice from inside. "Tell him we're not interested in his guilt trip." The door slammed shut. Harold stood there, stunned, his heart pounding in his ears. The pastries slipped from his hand and hit the step with a dull thud. His fingers clenched the bouquet tighter. A few petals fell, brushing the pavement like the last remnants of something once beautiful. He turned slowly and walked away, not angry, not bitter, just hollow. There was no argument left in him, no pride. He had come to give kindness, and they chose cruelty again. Later that evening, he sat by his window, staring into the quiet night. The flowers lay on the kitchen table, untouched. His thoughts wandered to his late wife. What would she have done? What would she have said? Somehow he could still hear her voice in the silence. "You don't have to chase love. You just have to live in a way that makes it easy to find you." He closed his eyes and held on to those words like a prayer. That night, something inside him broke, and something else began to heal. He realized that he was not returning to them. Not again. Not ever. His door was open, but he would no longer knock on theirs. The past had taken enough from him. Now it was time to give to the present, to people who showed up, who stayed, who didn't need a bloodline to be family. And just as he came to peace with that, his phone buzzed, a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then played it. "Mr. Harold, this is Elizabeth from the law firm. I've been trying to reach you. We have news regarding the estate of your late friend Walter. Could you call me back?" Harold stared at the phone, confused. What estate? Walter didn't have money, did he? Harold sat motionless for a moment, the phone still in his hand, heart racing. The name Walter tugged at something deep inside him. They'd been friends since high school, back when life was simpler and loyalty came easier. Walter had passed away a few months earlier. Harold had gone to the funeral alone, standing by the casket longer than anyone else. They'd lost touch over the years, but that bond had never really disappeared. And now, a call from a law firm. He dialed back immediately. A young woman answered, professional yet warm. "Mr. Harold," she began, "thank you for calling back. We're handling Mr. Walter Henning's final affairs. It appears he left something for you in his will, a private letter and, well, something else." Harold was stunned. "A letter?" he echoed. "Yes. It would be best if you came in person. We can go over everything then." She gave him the address. Harold agreed to come in the next morning, his thoughts spinning. That night, he barely slept. What could Walter possibly have left him? They hadn't spoken deeply in years, but Harold remembered the kind of man Walter was. Quiet, kind, always observant. They used to meet for coffee in their early retirement days until Walter's health began to decline. He remembered one conversation clearly. Walter had once said, "If I ever come into money, I'd never waste it on myself. I'd leave it to someone who still believes in people." Harold had laughed at the time, but now the memory haunted him. The next morning, Harold put on his best shirt and jacket, one of the few things he still kept pressed. He took the bus downtown and arrived at the firm's office. The woman, Elizabeth, greeted him with a kind smile and led him into a quiet room. On the table sat a sealed envelope with his name written in neat, shaky cursive. "Walter left very specific instructions," she said. "You should read this before we proceed." Harold nodded, hands trembling slightly as he picked it up. The letter was short, but it hit him like a hammer to the chest. "Dear Harold," it began, "I watched how you lived your life, quietly, humbly, with love. I saw how you cared for your wife, how you treated strangers like friends, and how you gave, even when it cost you everything. You didn't know, but years ago I hit it big. I never told anyone. I kept it quiet, just like you would have. But I knew exactly who deserved it when my time came." Harold's eyes blurred with tears. The letter ended with one final line. "You never asked for anything, but you deserve the world. Use it well." When Harold looked up, Elizabeth slid a folder toward him. "Walter left you a trust. It's substantial. You're now worth a little over 2.4 million, Mr. Harold." The words didn't compute, the numbers didn't matter. All he could think about was the man who saw him, truly saw him, and chose to believe in him when no one else did. Harold left the law office in a daze, clutching the envelope and documents like they were made of glass. The air outside felt different, crisper, like the city had somehow shifted in his absence. He sat on a bench nearby and let the weight of it all sink in. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a burden or a man forgotten by time. He felt seen, not because of the money, but because someone had remembered who he was when no one else did. He spent the next hour just walking. Not to any destination, just moving. His mind danced through every memory of Walter, their laughter, the quiet talks, the way Walter had always looked him in the eye when he spoke. Harold had never imagined someone would leave him a single dollar, let alone a fortune. It wasn't the money that brought tears to his eyes again. It was the gesture, the belief, the confirmation that he hadn't been invisible all along. That evening, he returned to his tiny, worn apartment. The faucet still dripped. The wallpaper still peeled in the corners, but everything felt different now. He placed Walter's letter on the kitchen table like a relic. He didn't call anyone. He didn't tell a soul. He sat down in his creaky old chair, brewed himself a cup of weak coffee, and stared out the window for a long, long time. That night, he slept like he hadn't in years. The next morning, he called the law firm again, not to confirm the money, but to ask if there was a charity Walter had cared about. They gave him a list. He wanted you to decide, Elizabeth said gently, but he hoped you'd continue doing what you've always done, helping people. Harold smiled softly. I think I know what I'll do, he replied, but first, I need to go somewhere. There was someone he hadn't seen in weeks, someone who had shut the door in his face. He took the same bus across town, the same one he had taken when he showed up at his son Ethan's door asking for help. But this time, he stood taller. There was no bitterness in his heart, only clarity. When he knocked, Ethan's wife answered. Her expression froze. Mr. Green, she said coldly, you shouldn't be here. Harold didn't flinch. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said calmly. I just came to say thank you. She blinked in confusion. Thank you, he nodded. If you hadn't shut that door, I might never have opened the one that changed everything. She stared at him, unsure whether to feel insulted or intrigued. Tell Ethan I wish him well. I mean that, Harold added. He turned and walked away, not a trace of regret on his face, because for the first time in years, he didn't need anything from them. He had found something far greater, peace. A few days later, Harold walked into a small community bank, one with brick walls, old wood counters, and the kind of silence that reminded him of simpler times. He met with the manager in a quiet office tucked in the back. I'd like to transfer the inheritance into several new accounts, he explained, laying out his plan with remarkable clarity. The manager blinked when he saw the figure on the documents. Sir, are you sure? Harold smiled softly. I've had enough time to be unsure. I know exactly what I'm doing now. With the accounts set up, Harold visited a modest real estate agency downtown. Not to buy a mansion or a flashy car, but to purchase the small building that housed a soup kitchen he had once volunteered at. It had nearly closed a year ago due to lack of funding. Now, Harold was back not as a volunteer, but as its silent benefactor. He had the deed transferred anonymously. The workers didn't know who saved them, but Harold did, and that was enough. Next, he paid off the debts of 3 elderly neighbors in his building, quietly slipping envelopes under their doors with no sender's name. One of them, Miss Clara, knocked on his door hours later with tears in her eyes. Did you? She began. Harold just smiled and offered her a slice of lemon pie he'd bought that morning. They didn't speak of it again, but something changed in the hallway from that day forward. It no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place of life. Despite his newfound wealth, Harold made few changes to his own life. He still wore the same coat, still used the same mug with the chipped handle. But now, when he walked into the local cafe, the staff smiled at him differently. Not because they knew he was rich. They didn't. But because Harold had started tipping generously, paying for strangers' meals, and sitting quietly with people who looked lonely. He had become a guardian angel no one suspected. One afternoon, as he sat on a park bench feeding pigeons, a young boy approached with his mother. The boy stared at Harold's weathered hands and asked, "Mister, are you a magician?" Harold chuckled. "Why would you think that?" The boy pointed to the flock of birds around him. "Because you make things better just by sitting there." Harold's heart swelled. He reached into his coat pocket and handed the boy a small carved wooden bird, a trinket he used to make back when times were simpler. "Then I guess I am." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Harold watched families walk by, children laugh and strangers smile. He had lost so much, been discarded, overlooked. But somehow, through pain and loss, he had found something deeper. Not just wealth, but meaning. And more importantly, he had discovered something the world had tried to take from him: dignity. He no longer needed anyone's permission to feel worthy. He had written his own ending, and it was just beginning. A few weeks passed quietly. Harold had fallen into a rhythm again: daily walks, morning tea, small kindnesses done without witness. Life was peaceful. But one morning, tucked between the usual grocery store flyers and utility bills, there was a letter. No return address, but he recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Michael's. For a moment, Harold simply stared at it, heart thudding. Then, carefully, he opened it with trembling hands. The letter began stiffly. "Dad, I know I don't deserve to call you that right now." Michael's words were hesitant, unsure, like the man who had once stood so proudly beside him had been chipped away by guilt. He admitted to being ashamed. Ashamed not of Harold's poverty, but of what it revealed in himself. "When you lost your job, I felt like a mirror was held up to me, and I hated what I saw. So I lashed out. I'm sorry." Harold sat in silence, reading line after line. Michael wrote of how the kids missed him, especially little Emma, who still asked why Grandpa didn't come by anymore. He said Lisa, his wife, had begun questioning how they'd treated him too. "We made everything about money and image," Michael wrote. "You made everything about love, and we threw that away." The last line nearly made Harold weep. "If you ever find it in your heart to forgive me, I'd like to come home, or at least see you." For the rest of the day, Harold barely spoke. He wandered through his apartment, touching old photographs, cradling a small music box Emma had once gifted him. Emotions battled inside him: anger, sadness, love, longing. He had dreamed of this letter, prayed for it in silence. But now that it had arrived, the weight of forgiveness felt heavier than he expected. That night, he sat at his small desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began writing. "Dear Michael." The words came slowly at first, but then like a river breaking through a dam. He didn't lecture or scold. He didn't list the wrongs. Instead, he wrote of fishing trips, bedtime stories, and quiet pride. He told Michael that forgiveness wasn't a gift he had to earn. It was one Harold had already given long ago, when he first held him as a baby and promised to love him forever. The next morning, Harold walked to the mailbox and dropped the letter in. He didn't know what would come of it. He didn't expect anything. But as he walked back, a weight lifted, the kind only forgiveness can move. And when he passed a young man sitting alone on a bench, Harold smiled and sat beside him. They talked for an hour about nothing and everything, and Harold realized healing doesn't always begin with answers. Sometimes it begins with simply showing up. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when Harold heard the knock. Not the impatient knock of a stranger or the rhythmic tap of a delivery. This one was hesitant, almost unsure. He rose from his armchair, heart beating like a drum, and walked slowly to the door. When he opened it, he froze. There stood Michael, thinner, tired, older than Harold remembered, but unmistakably his son. And beside him, clutching a small plush rabbit, was Emma. No one spoke for a moment. Michael's eyes brimmed with unspoken emotion. Emma whispered, "Hi, Grandpa," and the simple words broke the silence like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Harold knelt, arms wide, and she ran into them without hesitation. Her warmth melted something deep inside him, a space that had been cold for too long. Behind her, Michael stood with tears silently falling. "I didn't think you'd open the door," he whispered. "I left it unlocked," Harold replied gently, "just in case you came home." They sat together on the old couch, awkward at first, like people learning how to speak again after forgetting the language of each other. Michael apologized again, this time not with grand gestures, but with quiet honesty. He told Harold how things had changed, how losing his father's presence had exposed a hollowness in the life he thought he'd built. He talked about therapy, about reflection, about realizing that wealth without love was just an empty room. Harold listened without judgment. He had lived long enough to know that people break, and they heal. He told Michael about winning the lottery, but downplayed it. The money didn't fix anything, he said, but it reminded me that life isn't finished with us just because we're old or forgotten. He didn't gloat, he didn't lecture, he simply opened the door wider. They stayed for hours, drinking tea, laughing cautiously, crying freely. Emma explored the apartment as if discovering a hidden world. She found a photo of Harold and Michael fishing from decades ago and asked if they could go again. Maybe next weekend. Harold smiled, and Michael nodded slowly. I'd like that. As the sun began to set, Michael stood to leave. He looked at his father and said, I don't expect things to go back to how they were, but maybe we can start again. Harold smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. We're not starting from scratch, he said softly. We're starting from truth. When the door closed behind them, Harold stood for a long time, staring out into the fading light. His apartment felt warmer, the silence less lonely, and in his chest, where pain had once lived, there was now a tender, growing peace. A few days after Michael and Emma's visit, Harold received a letter in the mail, an invitation from the tenant board. They were hosting a small community dinner in the building's lounge and had asked Harold to attend, not as a landlord, but as a neighbor. You've given so much to this building, the letter read. We'd love to share a meal with the man behind the kindness. Harold smiled as he folded the note, warmth blooming in his chest. He hadn't asked for recognition. Most days, he walked the halls unnoticed, fixing things, paying bills, ensuring the elderly tenants had heat and the young mothers had hot water. But somehow, they had noticed anyway, and now they wanted to honor him. The evening of the dinner, Harold wore the same suit he had worn to his wife's funeral. He adjusted the tie she had once picked for him and whispered, "Wish you could see this." When he walked into the lounge, the room fell quiet for just a second. Then applause erupted, real, heartfelt, thunderous applause. A group of children ran up to him with drawings, pictures of Mr. Harold the hero and the grandpa who saved the building. A young couple he had once helped through eviction handed him a pie. One of the veterans from the 5th floor stood and saluted him. There were no cameras, no reporters, just honest gratitude. Harold stood at the front of the room, overwhelmed. I never thought I'd matter much, he said softly. I've lived a long life, made mistakes, been forgotten, forgiven and found again. But tonight, you've given me something I never thought I'd have again. A place where I belong. People cried, not from pity, but from resonance, from seeing in Harold a reflection of someone they loved or someone they wished they could be. He wasn't a millionaire with a yacht. He was a man who chose dignity over revenge, kindness over bitterness, and now that love came back to him multiplied. As the night continued, Harold danced a slow shuffle with one of the elderly ladies, toasted with apple cider, and even shared a few stories from his youth. But more than anything, he watched. He watched the faces around him, laughing, grateful, alive. And for the first time in years, he felt completely, unmistakably full. The sun rose gently the next morning, spilling soft gold through Harold's apartment window. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, the same one he'd used for decades, chipped on the rim, but familiar like everything else in his quiet life. The noise of the previous night still echoed softly in his heart. Laughter, music, children's giggles, and the honest voices of people who saw him not as a burden, but as a blessing. On the wall hung a single photo now, a picture taken during the community dinner. Harold stood in the center, arms around 2 kids, a broad smile on his face. Behind him a banner read, "Thank you, Mr. Harold, for all you've done." He had never imagined such words would ever be associated with his name. For so long, he was the one left behind, forgotten, discarded, but not anymore. Later that week, Michael returned. This time, there was no awkwardness in his voice. "Dad, I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said genuinely. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope I can earn back your respect. Harold looked into the eyes of the boy he raised, not by blood, but with love, and nodded slowly. Respect isn't given for being perfect, son. It's earned by showing up when it matters. This is a good start. Michael offered to help fix up the old storage rooms, turn one into a reading lounge for the tenants. Emma brought plants and books. Slowly, the son who had once turned his back now returned, piece by piece, not to make amends with words, but through actions. It would take time, but time was something Harold had learned to use well. One afternoon, Harold walked to the park where he used to sit with his wife. The bench was still there, the wood slightly worn, the tree above it taller. He sat down, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I think you'd be proud of how it all turned out." The wind rustled the leaves gently, and in his heart he felt her answer. Not in words, but in warmth. Harold didn't win the lottery just in money. He won it in a far rarer currency, in dignity, in community, in legacy. What he built, quietly and without fanfare, mattered. And now, people saw it. More importantly, they felt it. And that, he realized, was the real jackpot. As the story of his life continued, not in big explosions but in small, meaningful moments, Harold felt a deep peace. The kind that doesn't come from wealth or revenge. The kind that only comes when you've lost everything, given everything, and somehow still have more to give. And for the first time in many years, he whispered, not with sadness, but with gratitude, "I am not alone anymore."